Okay, welcome back. Our next speaker is Tomaz Gornik. Tomaz is one of the heads of the openEHR Foundation Management Board and is also the CEO of Morand. And you'll introduce yourself, Tomaz?
Thank you, Silja. Glad to be in Norway. And what I'd like to do today is talk about a concept called the postmodern EHR. And I'm particularly pleased that we're in Norway because a lot of the things we talk about today are already being done in Norway, which is fantastic. So, as Silja said, I'm the co-chair of the openEHR Foundation Management Board. I'm also the founder and CEO of a company building solutions in this space based on the openEHR standard. And I've been in healthcare for 25 years, healthcare IT, and did some work in telecoms as well. So I have a lot of experience building software, especially large systems. So I always start with this slide, and I borrowed it from Gartner. But this slide talks about the changes in healthcare and how the changes affect the provision of care and hence the software that underpins this provision. And it's safe to say that by the arrows that basically move patients from physical locations and clinicians as well to virtual locations, it's quite clear that the software needs to change as well to actually accommodate these changes. But what is also interesting is that this type of change creates new business models. And in the keynote presentation, you saw a lot of talk about ecosystems and about how different business models are basically fueled by the innovation in technology and hence need to be taken into account when thinking about the care of the future. So many of these business models are well known. A lot of them are coming into practice as we speak. But we talk about things like hospitals at home, care homes, kiosks, clinics, distributed retail, and so on. So why is this happening? I mentioned it's fueled by technology, but if we take an example of another industry, the computing industry, we will see that the change happening in healthcare is actually something that happens in most industries, especially the ones that are heavily based on technology, which is evolving constantly. So the personal computer of 100 years ago was a slide rule. We had this in our pocket and we used it to calculate things. But then because of the complexity of technology and the costs, everything moved to the center. We had big mainframe centers which were basically providing computing power and functionality to us. But then because of the lowering of the cost and the increasing of functionality and capability of technology, through the mini computer, microcomputer, we again have a personal computer in our pocket, if you think about it, which is today the phone. So healthcare, it's exactly the same thing. We had a very personal physician come to our home 100 years ago, right? Then everything moved to the big hospitals, right? They had the money to buy the equipment, diagnostics, and so on to provide good care. But now, through the lowering of the costs, healthcare is coming back to the consumer, right, to the patient, through health centers, retail clinics, and even just a personal device. Again, the phone, which is starting to provide certain healthcare services. I think just yesterday Apple announced an FDA-approved medical device as the new watch. So it's quite clear that this is fueled by the advances and the falling cost of technology, which makes it affordable to have huge computing power in our pocket, and this is also helping to disrupt healthcare. Now, some examples which are well, almost worrying to some, I guess this one. But actually what Walmart and the retailers are saying here, we're bringing healthcare where people already are. And once a week, they are in a shopping center. So they want to bring healthcare to the shopping center. And, well, they claim they want to be the #1 provider. That's probably going to be tough. But as soon as they did this, all the others had to follow as well. Another example is virtual care, right? Kaiser, the largest HMO in the US, claims that they do more than half of their visits virtually. It's probably primary care visits, but still, it's a huge number. This is one of the largest organizations in the world. Now, other examples which are less clear is this one, how hospitals, in this case ER departments, compete for patients. Now, an ER competing for patients is kind of hard to understand. I guess this can only happen in the US. But you know, you're driving down the street, you have a heart attack, and you look for the sign with the shortest waiting time, right? But what is clear is that all of this is fueled by technology, and it's very different from the healthcare that we know. Now, coming to IT, we have to think about another thing, about disruption. What happens when vendors get acquired by other vendors? Now, we have a guest from Germany here, and I remember in Germany, if you talk to customers, they were quite confident that with Siemens, they had their provider set for life. It was a huge, one of the largest companies in Germany. But when Siemens sold to Cerner, of course, this changed overnight. And we have other examples in Spain with HP and CSC, in France and Italy with the Dallas buying Noema Life. In the US, there's a lot of this going on. So what does this do to your data? What happens when the new vendor comes in and says, well, you have to throw out your old systems, you should now move to the next version, and by the way, the data doesn't just flow over. You need to think about either running the old system for a long time or actually spending a lot of money migrating this data. So just to set the stage, it's quite obvious that there's new players in the market, new business models, players coming from different fields, not just healthcare. And that to solve this problem, we have to start rethinking the way our applications are built. And I believe we have to start thinking about what we've been talking about today, which is platforms, APIs, and ecosystems. So this brings us to the main topic. And I start with looking a little bit about the current situation. And everybody that's in healthcare IT, and most people will agree that they're not really happy with the solutions they have. And it's a lot of issues. Mostly it's a lack of investment in the last years. Depending on the country, situations are very different. But I have yet to find a customer that said, wow, I love my systems. So you're aware of all this, so I won't dwell into this. But I tried to look at another industry. And again, I'm using a Gartner research in this case. And this is an industry that we believe has already disrupted. This is the ERP industry, the SAPs, the Oracle financials that run businesses. But what they were saying here is that the traditional monolithic systems were built for the needs of the past. And for Gartner to say this when before, obviously they were suggesting to buy the mega suite, it was quite interesting. And when I looked at this, I said, wow, you know, the same thing must happen in EHR software. Because in ERP, what we see now is that the existing monoliths are not sufficient for the needs of the digital economy. They're not quick enough, agile enough, innovative enough to take advantage of digitalization. And if we look at how we got it here, in the 90s, and in some cases still, we used best-of-breed solutions and connected them together using interfacing and integration technology. It didn't work too well because it was very expensive and very difficult to do, so we passed relatively little information among these systems, which is why we got the mega suite, right? One vendor, everything integrated, and it was, we didn't need to do integration, but we were very much locked to this vendor, of course. So what happened was, as a backlash of not being innovative enough in this space, a new architecture began to appear, which Gartner calls the postmodern ERP, and I've used the word postmodern and applied it to healthcare, as you'll see in the next slides. But what they're basically saying is that the core shrinks, and innovation happens around that core. So the best way to think about this is you find many companies who have CRM in SAP, but they go for Salesforce, okay? They actually don't use the CRM in SAP. They go for Salesforce. Why? Because it's software that is upgraded overnight. It's a different business model, much cheaper to run. It's usually better suited to the task. It's really quick and innovative in terms of upgrading. You know, an upgrade of a monolith is a 2-year cycle, right? And you cannot wait this long when you have a requirement that requires immediate solutions. So how does this play in healthcare, right? And why is it similar? We believe that the maturity of the ERP market is about 5 to 7 years ahead of the EHR market. And we see this because the requirements in the EHR space are not all that clear. Whereas in the ERP space, people pretty much know what they're looking for. And this is a requirement for a market to disrupt. Unless the requirements are clear, it's very hard to compete in a market. Because people just buy what some other customer has. They don't really, they're not really good at putting down all the requirements. And if you ask hospitals, 5 hospitals, they will give you 5 or 6 different sets of requirements, even though they're performing basically the same thing. So if we go to healthcare, what we see is that even today, we never really have one mega suite, right? The example I used with Kaiser Permanente, when I visited them, I asked them, so how much of your system, whole IT system, is Epic? You know, they are the biggest Epic customer in the world. They spent $4.5 billion with Epic. And the head of innovation, Ferguson, he said, not even half. And I'm like, okay, so you're the #1 customer, so they can't make everything you need? He said, no, it's the innovative stuff. We cannot wait. We cannot wait for the upgrade cycles. We need to have a lot of other vendors, smaller vendors, or some stuff we built ourselves. And the question then becomes, okay, so how does this coexist? So today, like I said, healthcare is in particular has already a lot of applications. You have a PACS system that's usually from a different vendor, a lab system, operating ICU. There's many different ones. What you also have is a lot of unconnected systems or badly connected systems. And then you also have systems that you don't even know about. And that's probably now with the GDPR and all of this, it's probably the worst. Now, this problem is so bad when you look into it because people have now started counting. They need to account for everywhere where they store patient information. And it is hundreds of applications. There's hospitals that claim they have 200 and they would be pretty good because I've seen some with thousands. Now, buying a mega suite actually doesn't solve this issue. That's the interesting thing. It will solve this part over here and maybe take away 1 or 2. But most people that have the mega suite still have all those applications. They're very hard to get rid of. They're very innovative. They actually solve the problem. But of course, they're unmanaged, and especially regarding the data. So what we've come up with is an idea that when you're looking for your next system, small application, base it on a platform. And the reason is that you can get immediate benefit from that application itself, but at the same time set the stage for actually migrating over time the other applications into what we call the postmodern EHR. So you remember Rachel's talk about the samurai and the ninjas? This plays very nicely into this environment because you have the core, which runs the business, and then you have the innovation, a platform which actually can foster innovation. It's multi-vendor. It includes many small companies building solutions, but they all connect to the same data. That's the key part. And they must all connect to the same data. Otherwise, you have this situation which we had on the left. Now, what's also important here is that this data is open. Okay? Because many vendors will tell you, oh, we have an API layer, no problem, you just build the apps. Well, it turns out that 99% of them actually still store data in a proprietary format. And this creates a lot of issues going forward. I mentioned mergers and acquisitions, change of applications, and more importantly, I think this creates an ecosystem that fuels innovation and actually can give business to smaller companies. And I think for all economies, Rachel was mentioning the UK economy. The UK doesn't have almost a single vendor anymore in healthcare space, not anybody significant. And it used to have a lot. So the innovation has actually shrunk, mostly because of what people have been doing here. And I think it's time that we open up. And this is not only in the UK, it's in all of Europe. The biggest 5 vendors are all American. Okay. So, to that point, you know, it's arguably the Nordics have the best healthcare systems, right? So I think it's high time that we start also seeing Nordic vendors who are global. So we talked about this, the bimodal approach, but let's talk about the data itself, right? The health data is, data in any industry actually is held in proprietary formats. The problem is that in health, this is a bigger problem than in other industries. Why? Because we want to keep this data for a very long time. You know, in the ERP business, 5-year-old data, you put it to a data warehouse, reporting, and it's enough. But in healthcare, we would ideally have data from the birth of the patient, right? And so what we are doing is every 5, 6, 10, 15 years, how often we change applications, we are migrating data from one proprietary format to another proprietary format. And we will do this 5, 6 times during the lifetime of this data, okay? So the interesting thing is we've solved this problem for some types of data. Images, the last 20 years, have been kept in a vendor-neutral format exclusively. There's nobody that will they will make an image in a different format today. Because that means that all the modalities can produce and all the applications can read those images. They can share them. Documents are also becoming standardized. Now there's efforts such as CDA, or even think about a PDF as a vendor-neutral format. It works really well, okay? But the structured data is always kept in the applications still. So what we are doing at openEHR is actually moving the data out of applications, having it in a platform that is standalone, which means that vendors can build applications that produce and consume data independent of the data itself, okay? So the architecture we get is something like this, right? We have 3 independent types of data repositories: images, documents, and structured data. And then we have a series of apps by one or more vendors at the top, and of course some common services. Now, the nice thing is that Gartner also recognized this in a recent research paper and talked about how important it is not just to exchange data in an open format, but to actually store data in an open format. And I think this is the unique proposition which openEHR provides. It's especially good at storing data for a long time, okay? And in a format that is not controlled by any vendor, that can be understood by the customer. Because think about this, you are a big research institution like Oslo University Hospital. Do you really want your data in a vendor-dependent format? Okay, so your research is based on this data. The data is your key asset, and more so, more than the application. Okay, I think people are starting to realize, and this is what Rachel was saying, that with data being the key asset, you really have to make sure that you keep it in a format that is useful for you, not just the vendor. Okay. So that brings me to openEHR. And I don't have much time to go into details, but what I'd like to point out that it's particularly good at managing health data. And one of the reasons is that there's a clear separation of what the clinician does and what the software engineers do. Now again, you would think that this can be done with any technology, but what we have here is a set of tools to enable clinicians to model the data, set the guides and rules on how this data should be validated, then pass on this to software developers to build software. So we're separating these 2 rules. And that's a key component of this. Now, in health IT, we have usually doctors coding, or we have IT people doing clinical modeling. We believe that both are wrong, okay? And that there's a role for the clinicians and there is a role for software engineers. And actually, the example in Norway where Nasjonalikatet is doing a lot of the modeling is fantastic. That's exactly how it should be done. Passing these models to industry to build solutions. So there's other things, but again, I don't have much time to go into details because we have a full schedule. What I would like to point out is that openEHR stores any clinical data. And this is a generic clinical process, but the main types of data we store is observations, evaluations, meaning setting a diagnosis or an assessment, then issuing instructions, and then carrying out those instructions. So these are the 4 basic types of what we call archetypes, the common models. And the models themselves, just to give you an example so that it's not all that abstract, are tied to a certain medical term. So in this case, it's the blood pressure. But what you will notice is that it's not just systolic, diastolic. It's actually the context of the measurement that is stored with the measurement itself. And the example I always give is that if I tell you that I have a blood pressure of 120/80, but I don't tell you that I was on a bicycle, you actually don't know whether it's high or low. Okay, so you need the context, you need position, exertion level, sleep status, tilt, and so on to interpret the data that you have received. We also set boundaries here so that we can validate if the data is correct. We tie into terminologies like Loing, SNOMED, and so on. Everything at the model level before we write a single line of code. Okay? And then this is then passed on to developers to develop their applications. And they can develop these applications in whatever technology they want and however they want, but data will not be stored unless it complies with the rules that we have set in the model. So there's a certain level of governance here that is actually ensuring that the data is of high quality. Now, if we look at how applications were built historically, we had different types of coding, different types of code mixed up, like user interface code, data definitions, decision and workflow. But we'd really like to separate these into layers when we're building applications today, because we have many different types of front ends on the same back-end stack. But what we now solve with openEHR is the data layer, as we call it. So storing clinical data can be handled by the platforms of openEHR. Of course, what you realize is that what about the other layers? And that's why we've recently, last year, published a paper, a specification in openEHR called Task Planning, which deals with the other two layers, the rules and the process. So we're building something we call task planning, but it's basically clinical workflow management, independent of the applications. And I think it's a necessary next step, because a lot of applications are really good at entering and extracting data, but enforcing workflow is another issue. And I think the big mega suite vendors did a good job of doing that. Of course, they do it in a very proprietary way. And it's very hard even to share data with those applications, but sharing process is next to impossible. So we believe that the process layer also has to come out of the application and be in a platform that is available to all applications. Now, just one slide on how we envision doing this. This is how today workflow is pretty much designed or thought of. And we believe this is fundamentally wrong for healthcare. Because what happens is, in healthcare, we're dealing with a live organism, which means that there's so many exceptions that flowcharts as simple as this just don't work. We would end up with a lot of flowcharts. Oh, I got it, speed up. So I'll skip this. I have to mention this one because this was actually Bjorn's idea, I think. So the idea we think about when talking about workflow is we think about the way the navigation system works. So think about this. You know where you are with a patient, you know what the goal is, and the system produces 3 possible routes. You choose one, but the magic happens when you take a wrong turn and the system needs to recalculate. And we think that this is much closer to how healthcare works than a flowchart model, because that's what doctors do. They get a bad lab result and they recalculate in their mind what they're going to do. But talk to Bjorn, he's the expert on this. So, okay, so I'll just finish with a couple of use cases, and I have a 3-minute video, so I have only 2 minutes, obviously. So openEHR is used in a lot of emerging markets, and more importantly, we're getting really good traction now in the developed markets, all with the exception of this small country over here, the US. But that's a story maybe for lunch. Now, there's many examples. I just listed a few. You will also hear from some, like the HIMET project in Germany, and DIPS and Tieto. So I won't go into detail, but it's safe to say that we now are getting traction with some really large players like Medtronic, like the Brazilian health ministry with 200 million people, like Moscow City, which I think I have a slide on. So where can we use openEHR? It's actually 5 different areas which we've come up with. Building EHR systems, building shared care records for eHealth, clinical research as a repository for that. Registries is actually a really good use case. And then the last one is ecosystem, so building an app ecosystem on top of your existing data. So the largest project that actually uses openEHR is the whole city of Moscow, and it manages centrally clinical data for 12 million people, about 500 institutions, 60,000 physicians, and about 106 hospitals. This is a really huge project, and it's probably the largest running EHR in the world. They've been doing this for 5 years, and I just flew in from Moscow yesterday, and they're also signed up for the clinical workflow to manage guidelines across the city and across coordinate care across the different levels of care provisioning. So I don't have time to go into the details here. This is where we as a company started using it 7 years ago, and we've now come to the stage where the hospital is at stage 6, MRAM, and it's completely built on top of openEHR, including closed-loop medication and some really advanced applications. The Philippines, 200 clinics using an application built by Ayala, the company. Paciency is about to go live with their primary care applications end of this year, built on top of openEHR. Plymouth is actually the one where I have the video, and then I'll just finish, because they're using this postmodern concept, and Andy, the CIO, really explains this very well.
My name's Andy Blofeld. I'm the Director of IM&T and Chief Information Officer at Plymouth Hospitals NHS Trust. I'm responsible for the delivery of the IM&T service to the organisation, and I'm the Programme Director for the core IM&T programme. We are a large acute hospital based in the southwest of England. We are a trauma centre, major trauma centre. We're a tertiary centre, and we have approximately 6,000 to 8,000 devices. We had a best-of-breed approach since pretty much 1999. So we would buy clinical systems and we would integrate them together using HL7. That's not largely successful. It was the only game in town pretty much in 99, 2000. There were no big box solutions, but you don't pass an awful lot of clinical information between systems using HL7. So we were looking for a much more integrated model. The core thing we're trying to achieve with this approach, the open standards approach, is to provide the same level of functionality that we could buy if we went to market and bought one of the big box providers, Allscripts, Cerner, Epic, there's lots of them. We want to have exactly the same functionality, but we don't want to be locked into a particular provider. We want the same level of data independence and supplier independence that people are used to with things like packs. So we've changed our packs 3 times. We've changed it from one system to another because it's a uniform standard data repository. It's easy. They go away on Friday with one, they come in on Monday and they've got a different one. It's all about the data neutrality, and that's what this open standard architecture will give us. We'll have total data independence. Innovation using the postmodern approach is an interesting challenge, and the way it benefits us, we believe, is that we're not starting from a greenfield position. We've got 190 clinical solutions that are already there, and we want to innovate moving forward, but we know we've got to start with these core 190. So a bimodal approach means we can start with what we already have, and we're moving forward with innovation based on open standard, and we'll gradually eat into those 190, either by working with the suppliers to move their data into the vendor-neutral archive, or in the most brutal sense, we'll replace those systems if they can't fit that model. So it really gives us the ability to make progress in a new direction using new technologies, whilst not drawing a line under what we've got already, which we just clearly couldn't do.
Okay, so I will just jump to the last slide and summarize. So I hope you got a little bit of a glimpse of how we see healthcare changing, and that today's monolithic applications really can't cope with that change, and how another industry, the ERP industry, went from best of breed to modern to postmodern. And basically, we believe the same thing is happening in healthcare. And this means that the future is multi-vendor. And in this scenario, the vendor-neutral data is a key asset. And openEHR provides a platform which can make this happen. So thank you. I've eaten up my questions, I know.
Well, we have one quick question,
Okay.
so we'll take the time
Maybe
for that.
in the meantime you can
Yeah.
do this.
So the question is, how is openEHR across hospitals, i.e. second opinions, journal information exchange using AI on X-ray evaluations? So
Can
is
you say that again?
Is this across hospital organizations, for different organizations, or?
Well, I would just say that this question is really not about openEHR. I don't know if there's anything specific. But what is clear with openEHR is that you can actually build applications decentralized, even by different vendors, provided you have governance on the archetypes. And actually, they will work together because the data is in the same format. So if you are across hospitals or information exchanges or things like this, become really easy. Actually, more of a legal issue once you've normalized the data into the same format. But we don't solve the legal issue, unfortunately.
No. Thank you very much.
Thank you.